So this happened in the summer of 1993. My dad and his girlfriend, now my stepmother, were living in Cardiff, Wales, in the city centre. Not a particularly high crime area, a lot of student accommodation there. I won't give the exact location, but there was a cafe nearby named the Warmest Toast Cafe, amusingly abbreviated on the front as Twat Cafe. It's irrelevant to the story, but I just had to mention it. So, 6 a.m. and my dad gets up and walks down to the kitchen to get his morning coffee. As he walks into the kitchen, he is welcomed by a random man sat at the kitchen table just staring at him. Being the cool, collected guy he is, instead of freaking out, my dad asks the guy if he wants a cup of coffee. The breakfast intruder agrees and joins him. A few minutes later, my dad's girlfriend comes in. She also doesn't freak out and offers to make him some breakfast. So, the three of them just sit down, have breakfast, and have a chat for about 20 minutes or so. Apparently the conversation was a bit weird and nonsensical, but they didn't say what it was about. Breakfast finishes and they escort this guy through the front door. After he leaves, they start freaking out and naturally call the police. The police come and take statements, etc. Later that day, they're contacted by the police saying that they apprehended the guy. It turns out that the guy was a paranoid schizophrenic and was breaking into the odd-numbered houses on the street. My dad's was the second house he'd entered. The first house next door he'd gone into was empty. This was where he left his tools, a sawn-off shotgun and a lot of ammo. His plan was to shoot anyone in the odd-numbered houses on the street. When the police arrested him, he told them that my dad and his girlfriend were the nicest couple he'd ever met, and that had stopped him carrying out his plan. When people say that I'm too laid back for my own good, I tell them this story, and it never fails to shut them up. 3 years and a change ago, my friend and I were walking this local nature trail at night. The reason for us being out there so late was to try and get some night vision shots of the local wildlife. Deer, fox, groundhogs, possums, etc. With my friend's super fancy new camera. We are both semi-serious outdoorsmen. My friend has hiked Mount Washington and the Adirondack High Peaks, for example. And we've done extended survival camping trips together. So walking a nature trail bordered by houses and streets was basically nothing for us. As we ambled along, mostly neglecting to take pictures in favor of talking about horror stories and movies in an attempt to scare each other out, a man suddenly walked out of the trees and onto the trail, about 50 yards ahead of us. He was wearing white overalls that shone in the moonlight. Butcher overalls. Extremely cliche, I know, but it was dark enough that I couldn't make out his face. Now, there are homeless people that live on this particular nature trail, as it borders a well-trafficked highway that connected two large cities. I've met a few of them before, in fact, and they were nice enough, mostly looking to keep to themselves, in fact. This guy, though, he just stood there and stared at us. I whispered to my friend that we should probably head back, when this guy charged at us. My friend turned to me and yelled, "Let's get this guy." So we began to run at him, and he stopped in his tracks, yelled, and then ran back into the woods. At that point, we were both anxious as hell, and jacked up on adrenaline. I grabbed my friend and said, "Let's get the hell out of here." We ended up running out of the woods through someone's backyard, laughing our anxiety away. We ran all the way back to my car. For the record, neither of us are tough guys, but we are both big goons who aren't much for backing down. Still, I'm glad no one was hurt. I have no idea what that guy's problem was, or why he was out there in the middle of the woods so late at night, with butcher's overalls. I recently broke up with my girlfriend of almost 2 years because I just could not stand her narcissistic mother. I brought up this story as an example of what an awful mother she has, and since it's been on my mind for the past few days, I figured it was time to share it here. About 7 months ago, give or take, my ex-girlfriend and her sister had planned on going to their father's house, located in a relatively small town about 2.5 hours from where we lived, to spend the week with him, and hang out with their friends that they hadn't seen in a while. Their mother was supposed to drive them after she got back home from work, but being the selfish narcissistic that she is, she tried to gaslight them and say that they never asked her to drive them, and that she already had plans that night and their trip wasn't worth cancelling her plans over. My ex knew that she was lying, but was completely unwilling to argue with her. Her sister fought back and forth with the mother until, eventually, the mother kicked them out and told them not to come back until after spring break. They grabbed their bags and walked out of the house and walked over to the mini-mall nearby. They were frantically trying to figure out how they were going to get to their father's house, until my ex decides to give me a call. I was sleeping at this point, as I had worked the graveyard shift at my job, and I had a near 4-hour cell biology lab on Friday mornings that semester. I answer the phone half asleep, and my ex explains the whole situation and begs me for a ride to their father's house. I'll admit, I wasn't too keen on doing the drive, but I felt awful for the two of them, and I could tell that they were desperate for help. I agreed, but I told her that I needed to catch up on sleep, and I would have to drive them late at night as I had work at 5 in the morning the next day. The girls discussed my proposal for a few minutes before my ex gets back on the phone and agrees to be driven late at night. I told them to come to my house, and I told my roommate to let them in when they got there. I went back to sleep and woke up at around 9 at night and got myself ready to head out. I walked downstairs into the living room to see the two girls in the living room talking to my roommate while he played Rainbow Six Siege. We talked a bit until we just decided to leave. They grabbed their bags and we walked to my car. After they both loaded their bags into my car, they hugged me and thanked me profusely for driving them. We left at around 10ish, and the ride was not very pleasant, as my ex's sister and I spent about half of it trying to convince my ex what an awful person their mother is. She kept making excuses, and her sister was getting pretty pissed at her for being so blind to her mother's abuse. Eventually, we got into a fight, and the ride just went by in silence. It was around midnight by the time that we were about, I'd say, 45 minutes from town, and we were on a highway that cuts through very few towns. It was nearly pitch black. There were no vehicles on my side of the highway at all, and rarely any passing by on the opposite side, and the highway was surrounded mostly by various woods and empty fields. It was a little past midnight, and my ex's sister was laying down sleeping in the back seat, and my ex was drifting in and out of sleep too. I drove through the dark deserted road with my iPod plugged into the radio playing The Boys of Summer by Don Henley when, all of a sudden, I see headlights turn on in my rearview mirror, and then I saw red and blue lights flashing on top of the car. I was pretty startled by this, as I did not see anyone driving behind me, so this person must have had their headlights off while they were driving. Also, why was I getting pulled over? I checked my speedometer and I was following the speed limit, and I wasn't driving dangerously or anything. There was no reason why I should have been getting pulled over at this moment. This woke my ex up and she was freaking out, asking what the hell was going on, but I assured her that everything would be fine and I would handle it. I pulled over to the side of the road and killed my engine. The officer pulled up behind me, and from what I could tell, it looked to be an unmarked police vehicle. And then he turned off his lights, which I'm pretty positive they're not supposed to do that. The officer walks out of the car towards my window and shines a flashlight into both mine and my ex's eyes. It was so bright that we had to look away, in fact. He then says,
"So, do you know why I pulled you over?"
No, officer, I don't know why you pulled me over," I responded. He claims that he saw me speeding and swerving all over the road, and that he saw my ex in the car with me and assumed that we were drunk. I tried to explain that we weren't doing any of those things that he said that we were doing, but he completely cut me off and asked me to step out of the vehicle so that he could test and see if I was drunk. I step out of the vehicle and stand up to face him when he turns me around and slams me against my back door, presumably to handcuff me. This woke up my ex's sister and she started yelling,
"What's going on out there?"
The officer lets go of me and tells me that I'm free to go. He practically ran back into his car too, starts it, swings a U-turn and just speeds off. I'm stunned and in disbelief as to what had just happened when my ex and her sister called me back into the car and snapped me out of it. They asked me if I was okay and I said that I was fine and that we needed to get the hell out of here. They agreed and I turned the ignition back on, rolled up the windows, and sped off with no regard for the speed limit this time.